Good evening and welcome to another issue of From the Stacks, the live stream program of the Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. I am Cal Beitzner, the founder and national spokesman of the Cornwall Alliance, and we have, I think, a special treat in terms of topic for you this evening. We're going to be discussing, and I hope we will have the author, Dr. Larry Bell, discussing with us an article that Larry Bell has written called Beijing Power Players Poised to Pull Plug on Prospects to Go All Electric. A little bit of alliteration there in the headline used by Dr. Bell or by his editors at Newsmax. This is a rather interesting article, something that I think is quite important for us to understand in terms of U.S. energy and climate policy, as well as national defense policy and our whole economy. But before we dive into that, I'd like to just tell you a little bit about the Cornwall Alliance in case you're new to us, and then also introduce a special gift that we would love to send your way. The Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation is a network of just under 70 evangelical Christian scholars, scientists, economists, theologians, and philosophers dedicated to educating the public and policymakers on biblical earth stewardship, economic development for the poor, and the gospel of Jesus Christ, the good news that people like me, sinners, can be reconciled to the holy God by grace through faith in our Lord Jesus Christ, who bore our sins on the cross and rose in triumph over death and over condemnation, over judgment, so that all who trust in him can be forgiven of our sins and declared righteous in God's sight. This is the best news that anyone can possibly give anywhere in the world, and that is the very heart of what the Cornwall Alliance is all about. Now, this month, like every month with the Cornwall Alliance, we would love to send you a free study. This is called The Climate Blame Game, and it's by the weather and climate statistician William Briggs. This is a study that goes into the various statistical problems with the claim that climate change is causing more frequent or more severe extreme weather events, that it's causing increased death rates or disease rates or property destruction rates and so on. It's a wonderful study and one that I think you will really enjoy. As our way of saying thank you, when you give a donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance, we would be glad to send you a free copy of this new study. All you need to do to ask for yours is to go to cornwallalliance.org. That's cornwallalliance.org. Click on the donate button. And then as you work your way through the brief donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply write in promo code 21-07. That's promo code 21-07, or the title, The Climate Blame Game, and we'll be glad to send you a copy of this wonderful study. Again, our guest tonight, if we're able to bring him on, we've been having some technical difficulties, is Dr. Larry Bell. Dr. Bell is an endowed professor of space architecture at the University of Houston, where he founded the Sasakawa International Center for Space Architecture and the Graduate Space Architecture Program. He's written 10 books, including What Makes Humans Truly Exceptional, just published this year, 2021. And his other books are available on Amazon and Barnes & Noble and a variety of other sources. So it looks like we've been able to bring Dr. Bell in. Larry, great to see you, and let's hope that the technical issues work out. Thanks for joining us tonight. Can you hear me, Larry? And can we hear you? We had a little technical trouble connecting prior to going live tonight, and not sure at this point whether our producer's been able to solve those problems yet. But Dr. Bell recently wrote an article. It was just last month in Newsmax and at the website of the Center, uh, uh, Committee for Constructive Tomorrow, an article called Beijing Power Players Poised to Pull Plug on Prospects to Go All Electric. This has some interesting thoughts regarding President Biden's climate and energy policy and the difficulties with it, the challenges to it. The, the great difficulty is that President Biden wants us to, excuse me, President Biden, let's see, maybe we can bring him on by phone. Let me see if I can do that. That may have been he trying to do it. Thanks for your patience here while we try to solve the technical difficulties. Hello, Larry.
Yeah.
Right. So what we'll do is we can use this for sound for you. And thanks very much for joining us this evening. Do you have some opening comments? Tell the folks a little bit about particularly what space architecture is all about and how your work in that field, involving an awful lot of energy, engineering and use of data and statistics and so on, how your work in that field gives you special insights also to the climate and energy combination of problems.
Sure. Sorry about my dogs. I guess that's one of the problems of working from home. But I'm a space architect and pretty much pioneered the field of space architecture. And I guess we can think of space architecture as kind of the general practitioners of space, in the sense that if you think of the space program and space programs from an international standpoint as being really dominated by engineering and science and so on, but they tend to be specialties. They tend to be individuals that and topics that really deal with very bounded kinds of considerations. And space architecture, I really look at as the general practitioners of space, because we look at all the different issues. We look at launch issues and how do you package everything into a launch vehicle, including people, and how do you deal with radiation issues, and how do you land things and construct things and so on. So we're really general practitioners, but the space programs by definition tend to deal with complex systems, and you find a lot of people who are NASA people and work for the Apollo programs and other programs who deal with complex systems. And of course, climate is a very complex system, and we don't understand all the variables and how they interconnect with each other. But a lot of space people are really have delved into the climate issue and identified a lot of I think faults and problems of the models and so on. And that got me involved a dozen years or so ago, looking at some of the science, and it didn't comport with my understanding of science in terms of what we were hearing, particularly the alarmism kinds of issues. And Fred Singer, who was the founder of the U.S. Weather Satellite Service, kind of got me into this. He's also a space guy. So I wrote a couple of books on the subject of climate, and the more I delved into it, you saw the relationship between climate and energy policy and so on, and that kind of left in the door open for me to look at a lot of issues that deal with climate, energy, and broader international issues that relate to these.
Yeah, I'm aware of the Right Stuff Climate Team, founded by a bunch of the engineers and other scientists formerly with NASA. Some of them, I think, possibly still with it. That has done, I think, really outstanding work, particularly at validating or invalidating the computer climate models that have been the basis of claims of dangerous man-made global warming. They've applied to these models the same kinds of testing that they did to models that they created to land men on the moon. And they've said these models just simply are not ready for prime time. They fail in all sorts of different ways, and therefore they cannot be trusted to tell us about future climate, which I think shouldn't be terribly surprising since, as you know, Larry, back in 2001 in the third assessment report, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change said very explicitly because the climate system is a chaotic, nonlinear, coupled system, it is not possible to predict future climate. And yet they've been trying to do so ever since.
Yeah, and since you mentioned the right climate stuff, I do want to mention very sadly that one of the co-founders, Tom Weissmuller, passed away a couple of days ago.
Oh, no, I hadn't known that.
Tom was such a heroic fellow. First of all, he looked at most particularly a lot of the alarmism and miscalculations on sea level rise. And
yeah.
I think he's as informed or more so than probably anyone on the planet when it comes to sea level rise. But yeah. Tom lost a very heroic battle with cancer, and he was driving back and forth between Maine and in Houston for his cancer treatments at the medical center here in Houston, MD Anderson Cancer Center, and absolutely heroically, he was doing that once or twice a month.
Oh, my goodness.
Driving solo, and the treatments actually were experimental and took also a big did a lot of damage to him and so on. Yeah. But he was grateful that the treatments gave him a year more than he expected, and what a wonderful man. I just want to give this tribute to Tom. He was such a special guy.
Well, I join you in that tribute. I had the privilege of knowing him, though not nearly so well, I'm sure, as you knew him. But through the international conferences on climate change, through some of the work of the Cornwall Alliance, he actually was featured in several of our videos that we've done that are available on our YouTube channel, Cornwall Alliance for the Stewardship of Creation. Tom was just a brilliant man and a very good communicator, and he was very generous with his time and his expertise to us. I had not heard of his death a couple of days ago, and that's a real loss. But I trust that the Right Stuff Climate Team will continue to function and keep on pumping out really excellent analyses.
I want to echo that, and that group of people have done a lot of really good work and attempting to bring sanity to all this discussion, and I think they are continuing. And I've been a member of the group. I've never been with NASA formally, but I did form a major aerospace company with the former chief scientist and chief engineer for the NASA Johnson Space Center, and Neil Armstrong was on our board along with others, and so I'm a member of the organization. They gave me a de facto. They brought me into the club, and I have spoken to their group, and they're doing yeoman's work.
Yeah, they certainly are. Well, I think you've done some yeoman's work just in this brief article that went up in Newsmax, and I think it's been reprinted in quite a few different places, and particularly at the Committee for a Constructive Alternative, cfact.org, good friends of ours. Your article title is Beijing Power Players Poised to Pull Plug on Prospects to Go All Electric. I do have to ask, who did that alliteration, Larry? Did you make up that title, or did some editor somewhere?
Well, I always write the articles. I've written nearly 900 articles for Forbes and Newsmax, and principally those two, but also others. And CFACT has reprinted quite a number of them, and so I'm very pleased about that. But the issue, I think, is one that I see is very important, that as we get involved, and I see how this is a big push, of course, for so-called going all electric, and we're going to somehow use the less than 3% of energy we get from wind and solar, and somehow magically transform everything to replace 80% we get from hydrocarbons.
Yeah.
And that's not just the U.S., but that's globally about that percent. And so it's absolutely insane. But what really benefits, of course, is China, because as we go all electric and our energy systems and networks, we make ourselves dependent upon rare earth materials from China. The country controls about 80% of the world's supply of rare earth materials. So all these batteries that go into the Tesla cars and so on are going to depend on these materials that we're going to have to get from China. Meanwhile, we have our automotive companies, including Tesla and others, running to China to capitalize on this big electric vehicle market, and I think we're just being pulled into an enormous trap. As you mentioned, you didn't quite mention, but obliquely the Paris Climate Accord,
yes.
which we foolishly, Trump was smart enough to get out of that, but Obama the Obama Biden administration had pushed us into that, and then Trump disengaged us, but we're back into that again, and making these commitments for CO2 reduction, which you and I know is a joke.
It really is. It depends on the whole idea that CO2 really is the control knob for global temperature. And it just simply isn't. I just had some correspondence recently with Dr. Richard Lindzen, the emeritus professor of atmospheric science at MIT. And Dick just said, look, all of this is just simply absurd. Where people are getting uptight about a change in global average temperature measured in tenths of a degree Celsius, when, the change between nighttime cold and daytime high in any given location runs 10, 15, 20, 40 degrees. In many places, even much more than that. And the change between winter low and summer high runs 100 degrees or more. It's just absurd that we're thinking that these fraction of a degree changes in global average temperature, which really doesn't, global average temperature is not what's important to anybody. What's important is the temperature in this or that local area. That it's absurd that we're focusing on that. And then it's more absurd to say that CO2 is the control knob over that, because there are so many other things that contribute. And as a matter of fact, CO2 has pretty much reached its saturation point. That is, it's pretty much absorbed all of the outgoing heat from the Earth within the bandwidths that it can absorb. And therefore, we're about at the point where no matter how much more CO2 we add, we can't make any difference in temperature. What do you think on that?
Yeah, you mentioned another organization that I have a lot of respect for, which is Dick Lindzen and Will Happer and others
right.
in the CO2 Coalition. I was one of the early members of that, invited by them to
yes.
participate with them. And of course, Will Happer is famously talked a lot about the saturation effects of carbon dioxide. And Will gives the analogy that what you discussed is you're painting a barn red, and the first coat of paint, it's pretty red, and then each other coat of paint you add, maybe make it slightly redder, but it's a diminishing return. Where the saturation is really a reverse logarithmic curve where each additional molecule have as much effect as the previous one. So
right.
when you have a couple hundred parts per million is one thing, and you get, in your adds carbon dioxide, and it can have a much more significant effect than when you're at 400 parts per million or slightly more, where it's virtually unmeasurable, and it only affects certain wavelengths.
Yeah.
So right. That's something that Will talks about, and the coalition also, of course, with the name, they emphasize the benefits of carbon dioxide in terms of photosynthesis and making the earth greener and so on. But also, I think, as you mentioned, any warming, nobody really, the planet's been warming since the mid 1800s when it began warming out of the Little Ice Age, and basically, and as Fred Singer, another dear friend that I mentioned earlier, had always pointed out that we have every reason to expect that the climate's going to continue to warm in fits and spurts, until either the next Little Ice Age, and whether that is something that is related to sunspot activity, which was suggested to be a factor during the Little Ice Age, where the sunspot activity is reflective of the changes in magnetic field in the sun, which affect the solar winds and so on, and the effect on in our heliosphere and our atmosphere of creating water droplets, i.e. clouds that reflect sunlight back into space. And all these complex machinations. And again, it gets into climate is really a complex system, as you know, that operates on all different forcing factors, and some operate on hundreds of thousands of years, and others are hundreds of years or decadal periods like El Ninos and La Ninas and ocean changes, which have absolutely nothing with atmosphere or nothing to do with carbon dioxide. We know that when the ocean warms, which it does for other reasons, it releases carbon dioxide. That's just like a carbonated drink does, and basically you see a rise in atmospheric carbon dioxide. That follows rather than leads climate change.
Right. Yeah. You've mentioned your own work in the space program, various different aspects of space architecture. How do we get folks out into space? How do we get folks to the moon, and so on? And I remember a conversation with Dr. Roy Spencer, whom I'm sure you also know. He's actually a board member of the Cornwall Alliance and one of our senior fellows. And he's a principal research scientist in climatology at the University of Alabama in Huntsville, has worked with NASA and with his colleague John Christie, oversees NASA's Satellite Global Temperature Monitoring System. But Roy mentioned at one point in conversation to me, climate science is actually a whole lot more difficult than rocket science, because the climate system is, as you said a few minutes ago, Larry, just so incredibly complex. It's probably the most complex natural system we've ever studied, with the possible exceptions of the human brain and DNA. And there are just thousands of feedback mechanisms. And for many of them, we don't know how strong they are. And for a fair number of them, we don't even know whether they're positive or negative. That means we don't know whether if the atmosphere warms a little bit, these feedback mechanisms will magnify that warming, make it warm even more, or minimize it, make it cool down, make it warm less. So rocket science and climate science are related, but they're not quite exactly the same thing. Well, you mentioned a little bit ago that one of the difficulties with Biden's climate and energy policy is that it is making us increasingly dependent on China for roughly 80% of the rare earth materials, the rare earth minerals that are necessary for making batteries, for making wind turbines, solar cells, solar arrays, and all sorts of other things, very important to our economy and even to our military. Enlarge on that for us a little bit, Larry. How does it come about that China has so much control over these rare earth minerals? Is that because they're only in the ground in China? We can't mine them here in the United States? What is it?
Well, that's exactly right, because we have rare earth materials in in the United States and Northern Hemisphere, we have quite an abundance of them. So it's really more a matter that they control 80%, not that they own 80% of the resources. And the issue is, again, the climate alarmists and the so-called the climate protectors have prevented the mining, and so we have only one organization today in the U.S. that actually does mining, and ironically, the processing of those materials has to be done in China, where it's being done by and a lot of these rare earth materials are being excavated by Uyghurs and by people that are really captive populations in China. And,
essentially slave labor.
Along with Nike tennis shoes and everything else. And so ironically, segueing a little bit, China gets a pass from the Paris Climate Accord, and they don't have to even arrest their growth in emissions and so on. They're building
how does that work, Larry? I mean, how do they get a pass from this supposedly global accord?
Right now, I think they get a real big pass because the climate loonies, here in the U.S., Biden administration are so obsessed with getting an agreement and getting China on board and getting other countries on board with and you have John Kerry to thank for that, and you got the others that are really pushing this, that they're giving, they give China a pass, they give India a pass, China gets a pass. China's building equivalent of a coal-powered plant every week, and they don't have to even begin to address that until 2030. And so, but it's this obsession with this climate crisis stuff that the Biden administration will do anything to get an agreement with China, and China, of course, is they got to be seeing great comedy in all of this this farce. It's really it's just a tragic comedy, really.
The rationale for those who actually negotiated the Paris Agreement, who wrote it and then managed to bring 194 nations into it, the rationale for exempting so-called developing nations from the necessity of immediate curbs on their CO2 emissions, which would have required immediate curbs on their use of fossil fuels for energy. The rationale was, hey, look, these are developing nations, they're poor, they need abundant, affordable, reliable energy in order to rise out of poverty. We shouldn't restrict that happening. And I agree with that. I think that's absolutely sound reasoning. But the problem is that when you make that cutout for them, when you give them an out, then that means that everything that we do in the United States or in Europe, in the developed countries of the world, to reduce our own CO2 emissions turns out to be essentially useless in terms of impact on future global temperature. I mean, indeed, the whole Paris Agreement has been calculated by Bjorn Lomborg to, if it were fully implemented from 2030, when it really goes into effect, all the way to the end of the century, 70 years, he's calculated that it would cost anywhere from $70 to $140 trillion, and it would reduce global average temperature in 2100 by at most 0.17 of a degree Celsius. And by the way, that would simply delay its reaching the added 0.17 of a degree by about 5 years. So it's all pain, no gain. But what China and India and similar nations get to do is they get to go ahead and continue increasing their use of fossil fuels, including coal. And you mentioned China's building an average of one new coal plant every week. They can continue increasing that, growing their economies rapidly. Now, as somebody who cares about the poor around the world, I'm all in favor of economic development in poor countries. But when one of those poor countries is a mortal enemy of the United States, and not just of the United States, but of the whole idea of freedom, of democratic republic sort of government, with government being by the consent of the governed. When one of those nations is the mortal enemy of all of that, it doesn't make much sense to me to be giving them a pass on climate change issues so that they can grow their economy and their military while we are doing the opposite. One of the things that you mentioned in your article, Larry, is that there is actually a serious threat to America's national defense, to its military capabilities, because of China's dominance in the mining and in the processing of the rare earth minerals. You mentioned the F-35 fighter jets, which are sort of the top of the line fighters for the U.S. Air Force now. That we may have trouble making those if China imposes an export ban on rare earth minerals, which no doubt it would quickly do if we came into even the near threat of military conflict with them, let alone actual conflict.
Well, you mentioned that this ties a lot of this argument, this discussion goes in a lot of different rabbit trails. But one is and I've said this, I wrote my first book, I think the title pretty much said it, Climate of Corruption.
Yes.
Politics and power behind the global warming hoax. And it's not that global warming doesn't occur, this is that the alarmism isn't warranted. And you can trace that back at least to the Kyoto Protocol, which gave, India and China a pass because they were, say, developing countries at the time and so on. Yeah. But as I've told my climate colleagues and friends, I said, it's sort of this thing, they say, well, why don't they understand it? And I said, because it was never about the science. It was never about the science. It's always been about the politics. And the basic thing is on the energy front, there is no alternative right now to hydrocarbon. We can't build more hydropower, and the environmentalists don't like that anyway. And geothermal is meager and regional, just like hydropower is, and they killed the coal industry. And so one thing is we look at wind and solar. All you have to do is look at the experience in Europe, and now the crazy thing with. We have the Biden administration killed the Keystone Pipeline. They tried to kill the fracking on federal lands and waters and so on. So they kind of got blocked temporarily on that. But you have this situation where at the time we're cutting back, we see that the Biden administration releases the sanctions on the Nord 2 pipeline.
Yeah, the Russian natural gas pipeline from Germany.
Siberia to go to Germany, and so Germany's importing natural gas from Siberia. It's great for Russia because that's pretty much their whole economy is fossil fuels. And as you mentioned with China, they've got their long game is. As we absolutely devastate our energy system, they will be by 2030. They are sitting high and mighty with control of the rare earths, with really the control of the electric vehicle market, because as China with 1.4 billion people is a very lucrative market for automobile companies. They're all running to China. And,
yeah.
Of course, China gets all the intellectual property and all the benefits of that. So, meanwhile, we build these wind turbines, which dirty little secret is that they're environmentally disastrous. Nobody wants to live anywhere near them because sound. But the thing that you don't hear, apart from the fact that they're only about 15% efficient, is that their life cycle is only about 15 years. So, after 15 years, you've got all these mammoth structures that are just rusting away, even worse offshore because of the corrosion of the water.
Right.
so we built these dinosaur structures. So that we again buy from China, along with the, you know, and they control the polysilicates now. China is looking at Taiwan as conquest, where the polysilicates and the computer chips and so on, that they control the market on that. So this is a geopolitical operation that has absolutely nothing to do with science. And as you look at, going back to your time on Roy Spencer and Christie and the wonderful work they're doing at the University of Alabama, the most reliable measurements we have of global climate really are from the satellites and from the balloons, which are much more accurate. As you entered the program with the introduction, you're talking about how these, not only are these projections crazy, you can't even reverse engineer them to recreate current temperatures. And so there's absolutely no empirical proof on any of these. We don't understand the interaction of the barrels. We don't understand the effects, and Lindzen gets into this a great deal on the hydrological effects of evaporation and clouds. And so as I know Roy Spencer has talked about this in the past. So what the modelers do, they say, well, we're not getting the results. Let's turn the knob on carbon dioxide and attribute it as a value. So it must mean that carbon dioxide has a greater influence, rather than recognizing, no, it has a lesser influence. So you can't, when my dear friends, and I love them to death, well, why don't they understand this? It's because it's always been a geopolitical strategy. And now also India is balking and drawing back, but with our international policies, we're really driving China and Russia together. That is not a good situation.
Definitely.
And India is afraid of that because they see these countries as great threats, as does Australia, and they have very good reasons because even on COVID, the Chinese have really pushed back against Australia, virtually threatening to bomb them, affecting their trade and everything else. So this is a huge geopolitical and military strategy that does not bode well for the U.S. to be naive and destroy our energy infrastructure that only leaves China with holding all the cards.
Yeah, we definitely are in the midst of something here where somebody's playing hardball and we're playing not even softball but maybe wiffle ball, and it just doesn't make sense, and we're going to pay the price. Want to make just a quick reminder to all of you who are listening that as our way of saying thank you when you give a gift of any size to the Cornwall Alliance, we would love to send you the new study, The Climate Blame Game, by the statistician William Briggs, another friend of mine and probably also of Larry's.
Absolutely.
The Climate Blame Game is a great study showing that the various things that people blame on climate change, whether it's more frequent or more intense extreme weather events, whether it's crop failures, whether it's an increase in prostitution, believe it or not, that's been blamed on climate change. Most of these things either aren't happening anyway, or there is absolutely no reason to connect them to any of the climate change that we've observed over the last 40, 50, 60 years or so. This is a wonderful study, and I think you'll enjoy reading it. I would hope that you would pass it on to friends and neighbors so that more people would be able to learn the lessons from it. So to request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply enter promo code 21-07, that's 21-07, or the title, The Climate Blame Game, and we will be glad to send you a copy of this. Larry, in your article, You mentioned that as we continue this sort of policy, the aim to electrify more and more of our economy, and especially to electrify our vehicles, we would give China a chokehold over batteries needed for US EV and hybrid production everywhere, and that China currently controls nearly 70% of electric vehicle battery manufacturing, compared to just 10% by the US. How dependent is the US economy on China at this point, and how much more dependent would we become if we do, in fact, try to electrify much more of our economy?
Well, it's even worse when you think of, as we electrify, understand we have an ancient energy grid.
Yes.
And basically it's very susceptible to cyber warfare and hacking, and I wrote another book on cyber warfare. I've written 10 books in about as many years.
Yeah.
And one is on cyber warfare. And so what we're doing is we're putting more and more intermittent energy on a grid at a time when California and other states are beginning to banish and ban natural gas hookups in their homes. It's not just cars.
Yeah.
Putting more and more demand on our energy grid, which is decrepit at best. We have three major energy grids in this country, and Texas has one. We have one of our own. I'm here in Houston, but we look at the foolishness here in Texas, where we put a bunch of wind on our grid, and then we know what happened with global warming last winter when we had a freeze and pipes broke all over Houston, and we lost power and pretty much throughout the state, and dependent on wind and wind energy, which was a farce, and realize how dependent we are on our power grid. And those that you mentioned, those who are disproportionately going to be hurt by all of this, are people in New England and cold areas, and the ones that can't leave. The ones that are really captive are the ones that can't move down with the snowbirds. From California, to Houston, and particularly from New York to Florida, which we're seeing a major exodus right now. And so the ones that are going to be hurt, and also and we're starting to see inflationary energy costs right now with I think the shutting down of the Keystone Pipeline and these other issues where it's already having an inflationary effect. And then you put on top of this, they try to pass this infrastructure bill, and they want to push this $6 trillion. I don't think they're going to get it now, and I think there's kind of an awakening occurring that they're not going to get that money. But all of this extra cost is powering inflation that's really going to run energy through the roof. And as oil companies get with taxes and so on, they really don't care, because all of this gets passed back to the consumer.
Mm-hmm.
We pay more for it. So none of these things are humanitarian. And I know, Calvin, you've written a lot about this in terms of it's really unchristian and unreligious and immoral to push these policies that are so devastating to the poorest among us. And I'm not just talking about in the U.S. We're looking at this globally, where the World Bank won't fund African countries and others to use their fossil energy sources, but they'll fund windmills and solar panels and these kinds of things that are absolutely. It's like the DDT thing where malaria, how many unnecessary deaths that disproportionately hurt elderly people and children.
Millions.
Because of this misrepresentation of even the World Health Organization has acknowledged of banning DDT. So we've seen science absolutely politicized, used as weaponized for purposes that are anything but humanitarian. Yeah. Climate is right right there along with a number of them. And now I think the whole issue of climate as a whole is, we say, well, trust the science, or follow the science. Well, yeah, let's follow the science, because so much, and I'm sure you know this, is that you're not going to get funded for science, climate research from NSF or anyone else, if you don't promise to find some drowning polar bears in it, and you kind of you get what you buy, and when you have so much of this purchasing power for the science centered in political interest, most particularly in Washington and so on, and you have the musical chairs between the organizations that are supposed to be like EPA and others, that the Department of Interior and so on, that are recycled back and forth between government and those that get the handouts from the grants and gifts. And then people don't like to remember about ClimateGate back when it was exposed, how they were really cooking the books, and that was of course not covered in the media, and we've forgotten about that. But there's been where these lead scientists that were so much behind the ClimateGate issue, and they've come after me, and I'm sure they'd probably come after you and others.
Oh yeah.
Basically have they were the ones that also controlled the publications. You couldn't get work. Science published because they took over the leading journals, and so it's very pervasive. It's very frightening.
What you're saying, Larry, reminds me of something that I read, just late last week. And at the moment, I can't remember where I read it, but I thought it was a very, very astute observation that when we get to the point where people are saying, follow the science has become an enemy of science.
Yes.
Because science is always open to correction. Science is always looking for flaws in current understanding in order to correct those flaws. True science is incredibly open-minded, but when we're told the science demands this understanding and this policy and so on, then the science has become an enemy of real science. A while ago, you mentioned that there is no empirical support for the claims of rapid, dangerous man-made global warming, though computer climate models can be forced to give those results. And that reminded me of, again, the same thing, where the science becomes an enemy of science, because science is really all about empirical evidence. As the late Nobel Prize-winning physicist Richard Feynman pointed out in what has become a very widely viewed video clip on YouTube called "The Key to Science." He said, look, the key to science is this. When we want to understand how something in nature works, we guess, and then we make predictions of what we should see if the guess is right, and then we go out and look. And if what we see contradicts our predictions, then the guess was wrong. Well, the problem is that what we're seeing over and over again related to climate change is contradicting the predictions of the computer climate models. I mean, the fifth generation models, CMIP-5, generally projected 2 to 3 times as much warming as was actually observed over the relevant period. If you ran them backward to try to retrace past global average temperature, they were off by 2 to 3 times. Well, now the 6th generation, CMIP-6, is actually even worse. And so again, we've moved away from real science, which is highly empirical, to this pseudoscience that is really driven, as you said, Larry, by political agendas, by geopolitical strategies on the part of some nations. I see it seems to me two things sort of coming together on this. And one is the anti-human attitude of so much of the environmentalist movement, which thinks that the world is overpopulated, that we humans are using up all the Earth's resources very quickly, and in the process, we're poisoning the planet. And so really there ought to be a whole lot fewer of us. And
well, you're right. It goes to this Malthusian notion that
it
dates back to Europe, where we're running out of. That was the first argument, that we're running out of coal, and it didn't factor in the fact that that new technologies would come along and basically new resources that we discovered and so on. But going back to what you're saying is that there's this kind of superfluous, self-righteousness of changing vocabulary, where I've been accused, and I'm sure you have, and others, of global warming denialism, and I love that word denialism, which is to say, they're taking the shaming view. If you don't, not only shouldn't you challenge their models and their projections. Even IPCC admits in the reports that they can't make projections, but nevertheless, they say, well, you're a global warming denier. Well, I don't know a single person or climate change denier. I've never met anyone that denies that climate changes. I have yet to meet anyone that would claim that. But it's a clear link to the Holocaust. And if you don't believe us, you're an enemy of humanity. And and we see this now with critical race theory and rewriting of history with the 1619 Project and so on. And they always do it with the notion that they
have the moral high ground. Anybody who disagrees is wicked.
And don't dare challenge this, because doing so, you're not only wrong, but you're evil. And you're denying what the Church of the Science is putting forth. And I think we're finally getting wise to that, where I say we, I think the public is saying, well, look at critical race theory, for example. You say, well, that's a whole different subject. No, it's connected with the same thing. It's this shaming that you are eternally wrong, and the salvation is going to the high priests and seeking some kind of deliverance. And science has not only been corrupted, it's been weaponized. Real science has been absolutely destroyed, because, as you say, the science is about constantly challenging results with empirical evidence, and then we're constantly developing better tools and newer tools to develop better models. But when you're only developing models to try to validate what your thesis is, and that's what so many of the people you mentioned have said, that you don't use science to validate a thesis. You use science to challenge a thesis.
Right.
Just like quantum theory now has basically disrupted so many issues, so many thoughts we had about physics. Newtonian physics has been, you say, well, when you get into the subatomic level, it's a whole different world. We're just discovering so many new things, new tools now. Quantum theory makes absolutely no sense at all to us in terms of those of us that grew up in Newtonian physics.
Yeah.
But it works empirically when you build quantum computers that are just exponentially more powerful than static computers. So we're constantly learning, and what we're doing is we're targeting progress by anchoring ourselves to essentially the theology of climate shaming and science shaming, and it's not only amoral, but it's basically driving us back to Malthusian thoughts about we need to go back to an agrarian society, we need to limit population, we need to stop eating meat, we need to, and all of this has been really put forth by the United Nations and their Agenda 21 and all these things. All of the things we're seeing have been basically advocated back in the early days of IPCC. and championing and saying, even if the theory's wrong, it's better for society. Well, no, it's not better for society, as you say. It's when you defunctionalize science, basically we're going back to a very primitive way of thinking, and it's one that makes us very vulnerable to subjugation by the high priests.
Yeah. And what really is alarming to me is how the anti-human population growth movement has become so intertangled with the geopolitical movement that really is centered in the Chinese Communist Party, which really wants to make China the dominant power in the world. And when you think back to China's one-child policy, when you think to the deaths of at least 30, probably 60 million people in the so-called Cultural Revolution under Chairman Mao, this is just not something that bodes well for the West if it prevails. And yet it seems that the Biden administration is just going right along with it. We have one comment that I'd like you to interact with, Larry, over on our YouTube channel. A viewer says, EVs, that is electric vehicles, ironically take more energy and create a worse disposal problem over the lifetime than today's combustion engine. You want to comment on that, Larry? Is that accurate?
Of course it's true, because all this stuff's going to wind up in landfills, and it's very difficult to deconstruct these batteries and salvage the rare earth materials, and so these materials wind up in landfills, along with all these other disposal problems, all these wind turbine blades and so on. They're just gigantic structures, and they're going to wind up in landfills. They're a huge disposal problem.
Yeah.
And I mentioned before, they have a very short life. But I want to also, with these EVs, there's other, some of these other issues you mentioned that they're not environmentally preferable. There's an enormous health issue that comes with not only the mining and so that people are so concerned about, but there's health issues with wind in terms of its, apart from making it Cuisinart to chop up birds, and also the low frequency sound is such that nobody wants to live anywhere near them because it penetrates walls. It really has all kinds of physiological effects.
Yeah.
So, and then add to this, and I'm kind of jumping around here because there's so many things to talk about, is that with these EVs, you plug them in at night. Okay, now when the sun isn't shining, we don't have, so we need to have enormous storage capacity, which means more and more of these rare earth materials, more and more of the disposal problems, to provide energy storage for these systems, and then we look at backups for the grid that that is very vulnerable. We don't have a magic solution to energy storage, and so we're really putting ourselves in a very, very vulnerable place. We're destroying our grid. We're adding to toxic pollution. We're adding to physiological health issues. There's no way you can justify any of these things.
And besides all that, environmentally, it's just horrific. A Harvard study last summer, released in August of last year, estimated that in order to replace all the energy all the electricity that we now get from fossil fuels in America, we would have to cover all the land in the United States from the Atlantic Ocean to the Mississippi River. with wind turbines. And then if we were to completely replace our whole vehicle fleet, going from internal combustion, fossil fuel powered engines to electric vehicles, in order to produce all that additional electricity, we'd have to cover all the land from the Mississippi over to the Pacific. Now, this would be environmentally absolutely devastating. It would be ruinous to all kinds of endangered species. It obviously would ruin the aesthetics of the American landscape. To me, it is simply paradoxical. It is ironic. It is downright absurd that anybody who would call himself an environmentalist would favor this sort of thing.
Well, Cal, none of this stuff's going to happen because
no.
First of all, as we expand both wind and solar, we're expanding into areas that are even have worse conditions for sunlight, for weather conditions. We have solar issues, but that doesn't work in areas where you have snowfall, ice conditions. The wind, it's fine out in some mesa in West Texas, El Paso and so on. That's great, but it's intermittent, and you only get about 15% of installed capacity. So none of that stuff's going to happen. But so we look at, originally I made China the enemy and said, well, they're the ones that are pulling the strings and doing so. But I write a lot on policy, and the not so secret little problem is that the globalist companies, and I'm talking now about the mega banks as well as the mega tech companies, Goldman Sachs and with BlackRock and so on, they're running to China to establish their businesses, and so they're all behind this climate stuff, and so you've got and the energy stuff because they see huge markets in China, larger than they see in the U.S. And then you have the second tier. You have the Coca-Colas, the Nikes, and so on that are running, also running, to China to do their tennis shoes and to get their markets, and of course using Uyghur, slave trade, people that do it, and they got children digging for these rare earth materials, and so it's absolutely immoral. But China can't do it without the complicity of the U.S. companies that are behind them, and it's the big banks, it's the globalist corporations. It's not a simple matter of capitalism versus Marxism, but it's the fact that we now have these globalist companies that basically have no allegiance to the U.S. They're global companies, and they're making huge profits on this. None of this would happen without and this includes social media, and it includes the censorship of science. We've seen this with COVID, we're seeing it with climate, where we've seen real censorship of information that's occurring, and that's terrifying because I see, my big ghost in the room is this is really a multi-generational combat with Marxism. It's divide and conquer. It's the shaming, the blaming. We see it with cancel culture, and whereas the globalist companies and so on see this as short-term returns, the Marxists and I have dear friends from Russia and from some other countries are saying, don't we understand what's happening here? And the Bolsheviks took over Russia. It was a small minority that took over, and they absolutely took over the country. And I think I'm optimistic. I think that the midterm elections are going to be a sea change, a benefit if we can put a hold on some of the craziness that's occurring. We're not going to cover the country with solar panels and wind turbines. but we may well do what Germany's done, is devastate our energy infrastructure as well as our grid, which is not set up for this, and open ourselves up to the cyber hacking that makes our grid even more vulnerable. It's this whole confluence of things and I see it more now in the science community. People and I know who are waking up, and we see CFACT and others talking more now about getting out of just being the narrow band of climate and seeing connections between the climate science and fraud to these larger frauds and these larger agendas. That we have to wake up, that instead of saying, why don't they understand us, we have to say, why don't we look at the larger picture?
Yes.
And understand how climate is being used along with energy to push agendas that are very dangerous to us.
Yeah.
They're amoral, and they're going to, and those that are going to be damaged the most are the ones that at least can afford the changes.
Yeah.
And they are the poor, they are the minorities we talk about, and the ones that have the least amount of influence over the political scene, although there's an attempt to sort of buy their allegiance now with voting and so on, with open borders and everything else. So it's like climate. It's a very complex, interrelated series of
it sure is.
And we who are involved with the climate science community have to look at the real forcing factors are political.
Yeah. I'm really glad you've just mentioned the power grid and all of the problems that are coming to that because of these policies. Because our guest next week is going to be Sterling Burnett of the Heartland Institute to discuss his article titled U.S. Power Grid at Government-Induced Tipping Point, something to which you referred a little bit ago. So we'll be diving deeply into that and all the troubles that are coming to the power grid because of the government-mandated push to increase wind and solar contribution to the electric grid. Larry, we've come to pretty much our time limit here. You want to make a few closing comments?
Yeah, I want to mention that Sterling, again, is somebody who's really been a stalwart guy. And you look at Heartland and I remember, I used to be more involved with Heartland. I'm not really involved with them anymore, but I've always respected what they've done. But you look at how they've expanded now, and I look at what Sterling writes, and he puts together some great information. But then now Sterling, Heartland, we see them expanding into the health field and putting out materials. And so Heartland has started, like so many of us, I think, just looking at climate and looking at these larger pictures, these larger connections, and how climate connects to energy, and energy connects to larger geopolitical issues. And IPCC is really connected to larger United Nations agendas, including and then we say these agendas connect to the World Health Organization, and how all of these we have to keep, I think, refocusing and stepping back and looking at these larger and larger pictures and interconnections. And I think Sterling has been such a resource for this, and we've got some wonderful people, I think, on our side that are trying to bring, including yourself, that are trying to bring some sense of sanity and humanity into these discussions. And I'm confident we're going to win this thing. I think public opinion has changed a great deal since the time I wrote my first book, where I was really an outlier in much of this. Even to get a book published on this was quite a challenge.
Wasn't that your book, Scared Witless?
The second book was Scared Witless. That Fred Singer and some others kind of talked me into doing, and so those are the only books I've written on climate, because it's kind of morphed in my mind into broader spheres of politics, and we've got to stop getting out of this mode where we say, why don't they understand us? Why don't they understand us? Because they understand us all too well.
Absolutely.
And that's the challenge.
Yeah. Well, Larry, thank you very, very much for taking your time to come on the program with me tonight. I hope to have you back on in the future. And much appreciation for all the work that you do. I see your very frequent columns, and I just think you're fighting the battle and fighting it well. Thank you very much for doing that. Thanks again for being on tonight.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
All right, you're welcome. And folks, again, I'll remind you that as our way of saying thanks, when you make a donation of literally any size to the Cornwall Alliance, 100% tax deductible, we would love to send you a copy of the new study, The Climate Blame Game, by William Matt Briggs, a climate statistician, climate and weather statistician, who's also a friend of mine. And as a matter of fact, he will be on our live stream in 2 weeks on July 20 to discuss that paper with us. To request your copy, just go to cornwallalliance.org, click on the donate button, and then as you fill out the donation form, when you come to the comments field, simply type in promo code 21-07. That's promo code 21-07. And or you can write in the title, The Climate Blame Game, and we would love to send you a free copy of this, something that you can read for yourself, something you can share with your friends. I think it's going to be a great tool for climate realism as opposed to the climate alarmism that so plagues the world today. Thank you again for joining us tonight. Hope to see you next week when our guest is Sterling Burnett, discussing the U.S. power grid at government-induced tipping point. Good night and God bless.